Socrates, the only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust, wind, dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
Cool. How's your life, Bruce, this week?
Good. Yeah, very, very busy. A lot of things on different burners at the same time. But some promising things cooking, if I can extend that that metaphor, metaphor. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So some of your efforts are turning into outcomes, and that's cool. What's an insight into emotional psychology that you can share with us, since you've been prepping that course this semester?
Yeah, I think one of the ones it's sometimes what we think about joy, for instance. When we think about joy, we think about ecstatic feelings, but it's actually a condition of neuronal de-stimulation. That joy arises when neuronal activity actually decreases. So, a lot of people associate joy with a highly activated state, but typically the affect of joy follows on situations where there's been maybe some buildup, but then there's a release, there's a letting go of that activity that actually expands and stabilizes into the affect that we know as joy.
What explains that? Like, is there a theory behind that?
Yeah, I think that, well, I have some students pushing back on it. Of course, they're saying, no, joy is different for me. So, I mean, there's the whole subjective question about how we even define these things and what qualifies. But, they're looking at interest, like I'm following in part for this text, the text of Dan Siegel. So, there's a whole interest to excitement spectrum where there is increase in activity, but then the joy is typically where there's been tension and there's a release into a more stabilized state where basically the need to be on the lookout, at least for that moment, of other things that might destabilize you or that were felt as imminent tension points. That's that release into that sense of immediate well-being is often interpreted as joy.
Okay. I like the kind of physiology and phenomenology overlapping. And do you like John's work, John Vervaeke's work on like telic, paratelic arousal and the kind of having and being mode?
Yeah.
Exacting of these like kind of almost polar opposite systems where arousal means different things in relationships like threat or creativity and self-expression and stuff like that. Cool. So I won't keep asking these pedantic primate bonding questions. It is great to see both of you. That sounds like you're having good weeks, and things in Florida are good. It's like the best weather here. I was at a park for almost an hour listening to this episode. It's just like 72 degrees, a little bit of a breeze right on the water, sunny. So that's the state of affairs down here. No mass shootings or controversial news, really.
To it yesterday, and it was windy, and the snow is just sort of mostly gone. But what that means is a lot of accumulated dust and gravel is now set free. So as I walked around town listening to it yesterday, there were all these dust storms.
Yeah, the transition from winter to spring is so interesting when there's ice involved.
I listened to it twice. One time I was reclining on my bed and I fell asleep a couple times during that. And every time I woke up, it was Chris speaking. So by the end of that round, I had the impression that this was entirely a Chris episode. But then I went back and listened to it while walking around and yeah, got the fuller scope of what was going on.
One of the things Chris did in this episode that I found really interesting was the way he philosophically framed COVID. Like, there's been a lot of critiques of mass formation and critiques of the nature of our degraded information landscape built into how we approach COVID. But, uh, there hasn't really been, that I've encountered, a strong philosophical analysis of what was going on there. And the way he positions it as like a playground for Kierkegaardian decision making, in which people who were either um, indoctrinated or pragmatic were then forced to confront people. And it didn't matter which decision they'd made, but they had to confront them as one who had made a decision, who had something at stake in the choice, rather than simply believing what we all believed or needing to get it done pragmatically. That was a fascinating take, I thought.
Yeah, I think COVID, right, was a existential opportunity that, like Heidegger says, like the city kind of hides reality, and all that distributed cognition can kind of be like a Maya illusion to reality, from all the technology that's barring us from these existential realities. And then the whole system undermines itself, starts acting crazy visibly, and like you said, like forcing decision into our lives again. Um, and it had that kind of Kierkegaardian irony of like confronting us with our subjectivity through this very external reality. Um,
I think we're about to be facing even a bigger situation like that very soon with this imminent AI revolution. I'm going to be part of a podcast series starting tomorrow on ontological shock, and basically that it's looking at the ontological shock of the AI revolution and the cultural wide decision points that it's forcing on us. So I think it's really timely what Chris and John are looking at in terms of, what is that active decision and what's involved in it. Really important to wrestle with.
Yeah, I think both kairoses, the high culture kairos of like the Renaissance, or high culture in China or wherever, is really interesting, but also these like culturally changing kind of low culture, like the AI and the COVID feel like low culture in some sense, that they're exposing existentially like what it means to be part of humanity and to be a person, in that kind of like they say, in the despairing, jarring reality, that you, if you're paying attention, you have to feel confronted by the aspects that it's evoking. I don't want to get too deep on this, but I did have some really good Jeopardy question quotes.
Yeah, bring it.
If then we can get back to despairing and musing about all the irony of the multi-perspectival abyss that we stand in. Um, so just in honor of the Zen Neoplatonism, they only really mentioned very, very quickly a couple philosophers outside of Socrates, Jesus, and Kierkegaard. So rather than just having those three again, and even Socrates didn't come up a lot explicitly, or Kierkegaard much more, they're just like the presence of their figure. So I have six people: Hakuin, the Zen priest or figure; Kierkegaard, since it is Kierkegaard's world; Eckhart, who's a Christian Neoplatonist, Nicholas of Cusa, another Christian Neoplatonist, Shunryu Suzuki, the kind of Japanese American Zen figure, and then St. Augustine. And these are a little longer, so I wanted to, for people that are listening, give some sense of the personality of the people. So instead of just picking a sentence, it's like half a paragraph for most of these. All right, you're totally allowed to pick, even though I promise he's not any of the answers, Anaxagoras or people like Socrates or Jesus. I just wanted to make sure that we're playing with as wide of a field as possible. All right, so first one, the most simple line is a triangle, and conversely, the simple triangle is linear oneness. In our illustration, we also see the angles of the triangle cannot be numbered through 1, 2, 3, since each angle is in each angle. As the Son says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. Yet the truth of a triangle requires that there be 3 angles. Hence, in our illustration, there are most truly 3 angles, and each one is a maximum angle, and all are one maximum. Moreover, the truth of a triangle requires that no one angle be in the other, and in like manner, in the illustration, the truth of the oneness of the most simple essence requires that these 3 angles not be 3 distinct things, but be one thing.
It's geometrical and it's quasi-Christian. It's got to be Eckhart, Cusa, or Augustine.
Yeah, that's exactly who I'm circulating, but I'm going to say it's Proclus.
I was going to put some Proclus, but I thought that would be too much for one day.
I'm going to go with Cusa.
Layman, any final narrowing?
I'll just go with Augustine, so we're covering the basics.
Good. It is Cusa. So in the learned ignorance works, he starts talking a lot about geometry, and then quickly gets into the one, the many, and then into like the triune nature of God. So that's kind of right in the middle of that. All right, good.
I'm pretty sure Eckhart doesn't use geometrical metaphors.
He's very negative theology, so yeah, he doesn't create a lot of images that he transposes meaning onto. All right, so supernaturalism in religion is the affirmation of the eternal and of the necessity of a concretely real relationship to the eternal, without which all human life tends to become confused and distorted, sinking into triviality and pointlessness, as being defrauded of its highest potentiality. There's more. I think that's actually a pretty good snapshot.
I think who the choices are again.
Yeah, it's Hakuin, Kierkegaard, Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, Suzuki, and St. Augustine.
I feel like Augustine was concerned with the supernatural, but I feel like the word concretely seems like it's part of the later European philosophical discourse.
Yeah.
So I lean toward Kierkegaard there.
Yeah, I think his modern dialect is pretty telling. Yep, that is Kierkegaard.
Yeah, good.
All right, so a frog is a good example of our practice. When you have been practicing for a pretty long time, you will laugh partly at someone who is involved in the wrong idea of practice, and partly at yourself, who is always sitting without doing anything, without making much progress.
Suzuki, maybe?
Yeah, I was going to say who's Suzuki. Yeah.
Yeah, he uses a lot of frog metaphors, and yeah, that's the Zen. No triune anything in that passage. All right, we'll do 2 more. So people should not worry so much about what they have to do. They should consider rather what they are. If people in their ways were good, their deeds would shine brightly. If you are righteous, then your deeds will be righteous. Do not think to place holiness in doing. We should place holiness in being, for it is not the works that sanctify us, but we who should sanctify the works. However holy the deeds may be, they do not sanctify us in the least insofar as they are deeds, but rather insofar as we are and have being.
So Augustine.
Oh, what's a good guess?
It could be Eckart's.
It is Eckhart. Yeah, he has a lot of. It's a little lofty, but there's still that negative theology where he's pulling back from symbols and action and. All right, last one here. For untold ages, it did not have a name. Then they blundered and gave it one. When it flies into your eyes, even gold dust will blind you, or like snow dust if you're layman, perhaps. A Mani gem is just another blemish on the Dharma. What is it? Most people only think that they have the real thing, like a man who confused a saddle remnant with his father's jawbone. The reason those who search for the way remain unaware of its reality is simply because from the first they accept all their discernments are true. Those have been in the very source of birth and death since the beginning of time, yet fools call them the original man.
There's a poetic brutality there that I associate with Hakuin.
Yeah, I picked that because I know you like Hakuin and it had that kind of flavor in it. And we talked last time, I think, or the time before, about that kind of ironic, seemingly irreverence towards like the thing you can't be irreverent towards, and how it can be a kind of cone-like irony. So yeah, I liked that one. And yeah, so that's Zen Neoplatonism. I mean, John talks about this stuff, but like he doesn't quote a lot of the weirder figures and some of the eccentric aspects of their philosophies. And so I don't know, I thought that was fun. Hopefully that wasn't too disruptive of the depth we were getting to. So let's start despairing again. I feel in my soul there's a stirring between this infinite part of myself and this finitude that I'm thrust against. And if I over-identify with the finitude, I become grim and fatalistic. And if I over-identify with the infinite, I become inflated and ridiculous. So I'm stuck in this Kierkegaardian dilemma.
I don't think this was a despair-prone episode. I think it's very encouraging, actually. And one of the places where Kierkegaard goes beyond or complements Nietzsche really well is by proposing something, which is a certain way of standing before decisions that helps you become who you are and actually adapt to what is. So, Nietzsche makes this proposal that you have to sort of catch up to your circumstances, that you have to reconcile with what is by getting to the point where you can say yes to it. But beyond the suggestion that there's an affirmative embrace, there's not a lot of instruction about how you might go about becoming the person capable of that. And in Kierkegaard, there's this suggestion that the way you handle decision making might be a kind of mechanism for deepening yourself in a way that produces the sort of alignment of which we say you have purity of heart and will one thing, where you're capable of showing up in the world as a fully instantiated, peculiar version of the universal by virtue not of what you decide, but of how you stand before the moment of decision, how you personalize and internalize that. So that sounds very optimistic to me.
Yeah, it does. I liked the discussion of truth that they had, and whether truth as subjective, and there's some debate about whether to consider Kierkegaard existentialist. Is he the founder of existentialism, or is he not properly that? But I think that demand for really mining authenticity, right, through the act of decision, is what, for me, places him in the existentialist school. And I don't know. I mean, from our contemporary perspective, I don't know that taking a stand there in a definitive way that truth is ultimately subjective. I don't know that that works. I think it's important to hold multiple kinds of truthing, Um, I'm thinking about, of course, Habermas, but also even Latour. Latour has these different modes of becoming, modes of being and becoming, and each one has its own modes of veridiction, its own modes of speaking and arriving at the truth. And it seemed really what Kierkegaard emphasizes and what Chris emphasized um, is truth in a sense, uh, as truth in the mode of veridiction of the mode of religion, according to Latour. He has the different, but for Latour, truth in the mode of religion is the statement is true or the act is true if it transforms you in its reception or doing. Right? If it actually acts in a way that it results in a ontological and characterological transformation, then it drops to that authentic existential depth in a way that's reconfiguring.
Yeah, because then
go
ahead.
There's something about the embodied participatory transformational truth that is, how to say, indifferent to propositional truth. It doesn't negate propositional truth. It's just an additional separate truth domain, right? You can still look at and affirm propositional truths and investigate them on their own merits as to whether they're true or not. But that's not the type of truth that we're concerned about in a spiritual philosophical discourse. And the distinction that leaps out at me about that kind of truth, the transformative truth, is the time frame issue. It ties a little bit to the joy question too. Like, is it of a moment or is it an accumulation over time? Right? Because there's a subjective truth that might be true for you in a participatory moment, and that, I think, is a lot of the source of anxiety for people who worry about the subjectivization of truth. They're worried that it might be true in a moment and not actually map to reality. But when that truth, when that transformation through truthfulness is accumulating over time, I think we can make a strong argument that it's increasing your adaptive fit to the rest of reality that you're embedded in. And I think Chris talks a little bit about truth and the decision and the way you stand before the good. And I was thinking about that, how it's not necessary to be conscious that you are standing before the good, because what you're actually doing is you're maturing your character in a way that implicitly corresponds to value, which also speaks to the fact that it is an adaptive fit. But I think what you're looking for is not the truth that just transforms you in a moment, but a change that the transformation itself builds up over time and makes you a more truthful character in general, which is to say more adaptively fit to the world.
There's something from the diamond approach that I really appreciate. It's an inquiry. I don't think we've talked about it in this discussion, in our series of discussions before, but it's this question that you pose to yourself, which is, what is my history, or what is your history with the love of truth? And that is a real driver to clarify, burn through your own ability to engage in authentic, deep, transformative inquiry, is to gain clarity around your history and your relationship to love of truth. And there's a lot of ways that you can mine into what is meant by love of truth, but it's I think it's really fruitful to look at that question.
Yeah, because I mean the aspirational nature of what they're talking about is much more in the agent arena, which you can hold as this ecstatic. I think all those people we were quoting and like they're holding that as this kind of ecstatic participation that has a lot of mystery and transjectivity in it. And then these figures are so encompassing that they can transform your kind of ecstatic agent arena relationship with yourself and the world, not propositionally, not because you have all these facts that you learned from some episode or something, but just by I love that there's a lot of like developmental psychology that supports what they were saying about the crowd, how when you interact with certain kind of mediums, whether it's like a pseudonymous kind of author or a figure like Christ or Socrates or a crowd, and how all of them do this like breaking through to the self in different ways or preparing the self to be broken through. Um, Again, not propositionally, not where you have some kind of like intellectual epiphany, but in the encounter existentially or like in the embodied sense with these kinds of things, it throws you like more into right relationship with reality in such a way that there's a potential for growth, or not even linear growth, not like a moreness of you, but like an actual kind of newness to you.
In reflecting on it for myself, there's something about the relationship of love of truth to just love itself. 'Cause I think there's something about love that desires a connection to, a participation in, with whatever is as it is in itself truly, and a willingness that that thing can be itself truly. So there's to me, there's, if you go deeply into that question of love of truth, it really, I think, opens up just the whole field of, and maybe they were, getting at this a little bit with the discussion of that transformation into agape.
I think about value a lot in this discussion. The way we stand before the true, the good, the beautiful, or any of the great value formulations affords us the possibility to go forward to a place where we're simply embodying the conductive stance of value appreciation itself, right, which is like love. But the thing that the value phrasing offers me in consideration of this episode is the importance of there really being value on both sides of the decision you're trying to make. This is one of the things that's not totally clear about people who took a stand on COVID one way or the other. It's not clear to me that most of them encountered validity on either side and were torn. I don't think most of them entered into a pathos. And what we see Kierkegaard doing through his inhabitation of characters and perspectives is presenting validities on both sides. Right? The reason there's an either or is because there is something valid and something valuable in both directions. And they exert this pull on each other because of that. And if you're willing to undergo the fire of that pull between values, then regardless of the decision you make, your embodied relationship to value is refined and abstracted, and you come away with just a more direct sense of what is valuable per se. And I think that also, as you hinted at a moment ago, Bruce, fits in with your history of how you relate to value. Now, partly there is a real history, and partly there's a retroactive conviction of yourself as one who must have had such a history because now you stand before this refined sense of value.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Kierkegaard gets right therapeutically is you have to have this encounter consciously, right? Like they Johns, I think, said like can't be an impulse of like, oh, I tend to be clean during COVID, or I tend to be contrarian. It has to be a really like a conscious encounter with the other that turns back on oneself in such a way that like I don't know if you know Maria Prophetess, the alchemist, like the one become the two become the three, and the three become the one again. It's like that transformative kind of cycle of like ego to ego, super ego to like third thing that transcends both of those two. And like that reminded me a lot of what you were saying from that layman, that they were really hinting at, because it was always a very conscious confrontation with Socrates, and it wasn't purely transactional or like mythological in a fairy tale kind of sense.
Something so personal about the conflict between two validities that no matter which side you end up on, socially, people reinforce that in various ways, right? It's great that you didn't marry Regina, or it's great that you married Regina. There's populations of people who are willing to reinforce any particular decision, but there's something they will never know, which is you could have gone either way, right? They don't know what it's like to have gone either way. That can't really be spoken at the level of the social surface. And I think that's one of the things Kierkegaard calls us toward in his philosophy of the decision, is not only the tension that exists between options when both options are valid, but that really excruciatingly personal experience of having been the one who was between two valid choices.
I think there's some relationship here which we maybe need to unpack a little bit, but that question of standing authentically between two valid choices and letting that work on you. I think about that in terms of some of my own explorations about translineage spirituality, one in which it could be a Zen Platonism that isn't just this systematic synthesis into a new entity, but that really stands in that decisional point between the validities that move in different directions. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there can't be higher synthetic perspectives taken, that synthesize or that recognize the not two-ness across the different domains. And yet at the same time, there is that demand to authentically honor each in its concreteness and particularity and uniqueness, in a way that, for me, people like Abhishektananda or Henry Lasso or Raimon Panikar, or Ramakrishna, different kinds of people who stand in between traditions. And I think this gets at some of what they were talking about in terms of what is John getting at with ecologies of practice. Is he recommending a super Hegelian system? Or is he recommending something that is more like what they've been exploring in this episode, taking this existential Kierkegaardian stand in the midst of these valid practice opportunities, in a way that allows that tension to work on you?
Yeah, because I mean the Hegelian synthesis John does not like. the idea that there's like A and B, and then this third thing that perfectly emerges from A and B, because it lacks honoring A and B. It brackets A and B away from reality, so you can't stand in the tension of the ambiguity of A and B, and you get this neat synthesis. It's always synthesizing, and you're in this beautiful flow of synthesis, and you can miss this tension that these existentialists are pointing to between like concepts and reality and individuality and shared existence. Yeah, John, in an earlier episode, like episode 8 or 9, like cites this guy that's talking about all these I positions within us, and then this transjectivity between us, and so we're these weird intrasubjective unities of many, and then also like we're not even just like subjectively these multiplicities, because they're all transjective. They're all anticipating and participating in culture, and you can't separate all of that. There's so much dynamics happening that, like you were saying, Bruce, I think just like sitting with it consciously and bearing the reality that you both are and are not, like John was saying, this kind of Janus-faced seemingly tyranny. If you look at it as like a pure tragedy, it's kind of tyrannical. Like what do they say? The Gnostics, they have the demiurge, the evil demiurge that's trapped you in this kind of conscious suffering. And yeah, I love the Hegel versus Gnostic kind of elements, and the Kyoto school kind of thinkers also pick this up, because a lot of them studied under kind of post-Hegelian, post-Heideggerians, or even just Heidegger, like not even post-Heideggerians, just actual Heidegger.
Within certain organic limits, I think we need to imagine that different philosophies are useful for different types of people, right? That when you gather together people who are really interested in Kierkegaard, Gnosticism, and Zen, there's a self-selection element to that gathering, which describes at the heart of the philosophy a set of approaches and orientations that we hope are useful to a certain type of person. But that may not be useful in general, right? It may be that in general, or for some group of the population, they need a good system, right? They need an ecology of practices that seems like just a unified functional thing that they can deal with as best they can and then get back to their lives. That this post-Hegelian Kyoto existential transformation of the self through staying with the trouble is possibly a special task for people who wish to engage that, who find that to be a fascinating route to authenticity, but it is not necessarily the best thing for everyone.
I did like how they brought up that, because I felt that too, this argument that some of these choices between ways is really an aesthetics thing. Yeah, that there's this which I don't think is merely a relative or surface thing. I think you can go deep with that whole question about it being an aesthetic choice. But I feel that too, that there's sometimes situationally, temperamentally, there's all different reasons why, I can think in my own life of how I've inhabited different spiritual traditions and paths, based on the exigencies and the needs and all of those things that were prevalent at a time.
What came to my mind was the introduction to Nietzsche's musings on the nature of the feminine. I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil. But he starts off by describing how underneath all of your philosophical positions, there's some deeper preconscious bedrock of your character, your temperament that you can't get away from. And all you're going to be able to do is sort of unfold the deep aesthetics of that. And then that's his segue to say, now that I've confessed the thing that's most embarrassing to a philosopher, that their objectivity is really subjective, perhaps I will be allowed to say some things that are embarrassing about women as well. And then he goes into this thing about the feminine, but it's a beautiful segue, and he makes that confession that they were talking about in this episode.
Right, it's both, because there's like a everyone gravitates towards things that they're dispositionally and largely unconsciously driven towards. Um, but also it has to work in reality, right? It has to be adaptive and has to like uh, confer normativity upon the user of the philosophy. Um, and so, and there are many, like, what do they call it? Equipotency in like a systems language, where there's like many ways to get the same outcome or to creatively solve problems. So yeah, I think I mean the whole field of philosophical counseling is what you're often doing. If you're learning someone and going, oh, you're a Nietzsche fellow, or oh, you really like Sappho of Lesbos, so let's push you towards this kind of Grecian love poetry or something, and people start to like everyone just needs a frame, right, to some degree, and it's like these why invent my own frame when I could just hijack Socrates's or Bodhidharma's and solve this annoying problem of like thinking about life. And that's why Kierkegaard is so great, because he both does that. He's both idiosyncratic and universal in his kind of how he wants to confront you. It's really on both. It never loses because of Christ and the universality of this suffering and crying God who's embodied himself into history. Yeah, the idiosyncratic, subjective, intersubjective project or whatever is so well on display.
It's not there's an argument here that it doesn't fail to be objectively valid because it's idiosyncratically peculiar to the person, right? There's even a stronger argument in Kierkegaard, which is that's the only way to engage in the objective is from the personal particular position. This is very important to me because of the people I've been with in my life who seem to have the most conductivity or beingness or some existential quality that impressed me as being something I wanted to develop in myself, often said things that were at odds with each other or nonsensical or seemed demonstrably false. In particular, in my devotion to some elements of the Gurdjieff work and to things like Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is a perversely idiosyncratic imaginal document. How do you handle that as a piece of dharma? It's not stating things that seem like truths for everyone. It's confessing an individual's nonsense. But the suggestion is that this individual has done something to themselves which has raised their nonsense to a different caliber. And that's very suggestive to me, right? And what they're proposing is not that you believe their nonsense, but that you do something like what they did to raise your peculiarity to a new level. And that has objective significance, even though it has to be approached through the subjective.
I think that's a lot of what I like about Socrates in general, is that the path to salvation is personal in a sense. It's always dialoguing where the other person is at and where Socrates is at, both inwardly and even like when they're at the Piraeus or when they're on the way to a festival. Like they're so embodied and embedded in their selves and their culture in a way that like um, it's developmental. It forces the individual to confront the transcendent in some sense, and it's always the individual that is self-transcending, not the kind of, not that it's wrong, but it's often kind of incomplete, like the depersonalization of a lot of the Eastern traditions that then seek harmony from there. It's kind of cool the way the Western tradition so wants the individual to confess or the individual to look within I don't know. I like that a lot about how Kierkegaard does that with his retelling of the Abraham story. It's always got a kind of a personality to it, that it's throwing you back on your social existential dimension. And you can't just go, yes, the universe is one and it's many, and you have these platitudes that are universally kind of true, but they don't kind of force you to grapple inwardly in the same way. What does John say? John says he's like into uh, sadomasochistic philosophers because of his upbringing. He's just very blunt and candid about that. And he's like, oh, well, there's people that could be drawn to Kierkegaard precisely because they have a somewhat maladaptive superego structure that they inhabited from their childhood. That's like, oh yeah, this kind of punishment towards the good is salvific. Um,
Atwood and Stollerow, they developed intersubjective psychology, which really, when you look at the depth that they take it to, it's really a transjective psychology. But they developed intersubjective psychology out of an experiment of looking at how the characterological elements and life history elements may have played a role in the formulation of different psychological schools. And they didn't do that to invalidate Freud or Pearls or anything like that, but they did show how each of those approaches was really a depth unpacking of the uniqueness and particularity of the person, and that an adequate psychological system is one that is aware of that and can navigate across those boundaries in a particular way.
Yeah, to come to Nietzsche again, there's a famous section where he says that it gradually dawned on him over years that what every philosophy is, which is autobiography, right? So then that's true of psychotherapeutic modalities. It's true of schools of psychology. It's true of schools of philosophy. It's true of schools of spirituality, that they're flavored not only by the individual, but by the psychological circumstances in which that individual came into the world. And they might be useful or destabilizing, depending on the particular arrangement of the psyche that other people come to it with. You know, I can see how someone like John, who thinks that he's internalized a sadomasochistic superego because of his childhood, would be wary of certain kinds of ascetic systems because it might re-trigger that. Likewise, I got a very benign, very allowing kind of superego, which has always made me quite interested in systems where I would inflict something on myself because I feel I'm in no danger from that.
Yeah, Jung talks about complexes in the same way. And it's like complexes aren't evil and they're not like things to be destroyed if they're, especially if they're not really maladaptive. Like they're the things that are shaping our psyche consciously and unconsciously and from a historic and even like a collective historic movements are all just there. And again, like Bruce was saying, like we've been saying a lot, like it's really just consciously encountering these things that you self transcend them or collectively transcend them. And you see that in Socrates, in Christ, in Kierkegaard, that they're kind of living in the, we could just use Christ, right, in the Roman complex, and they encounter it in such a way that it like manifests as an imaginal Satan and reveals the secrets that will shift culture for 200 years. And it's not supernatural. It's not, I mean, maybe it is, I don't know, but it's not because necessarily that God incarnated and fulfilled the prophecy of the Jews, but because a psyche consciously wrestled with its tradition in such a profound way. And then again, Kierkegaard in all of his works is kind of asking you to do that as well. And especially if you're in the 1850s Christian European culture, then you can really do it honestly with the symbols he's evoking, and a lot of times with the spirit he's really feeling in himself. And then like John says, like symbols live and die. So who knows what will happen as one idiosyncratically encounters that stuff. But it's the only way, in some sense, to deal with like the AI question or the religion and science question, like those kind of like paradoxical, ill-defined problems of whatever age you happen to be in.
Couple unclear things floating in my mind, trying to decide how to bring them together. This is in our meetings. This is the first one where I showed up with zero notes or thoughts about what I wanted to talk about. I just watched it and showed up. But one of the things that stood out for me, because of resonance with my own concerns and also, you know, some of those of friends, is the discussion that they had around the nature of what they were doing, something very private in public, and that tension between the public and the private, and that there was a really fruitful enactment of that tension, you could say, in Kierkegaard's life. And I was relating to that, to how, for me, important Thomas Merton was at one point in my development. And I really was deeply interested in Thomas Merton's life. But like Kierkegaard, he really wrestled between the public and the private, between the, you know, the with the monastic withdrawal and the retreat into the authentic encounter with the depths of the individual, where only in that raw existential encounter will you unfold, you know, kind of the meaningfulness of life. And yet he could not abide by the rules of Gethsemane and maintained against those rules, and with special exceptions, you know, contact with social movements, with civil rights movements, with thinkers from multiple traditions, with intermonastic and interreligious dialogue. And so it was a unique wrestling with and boundary between the validities of both lives, right? Between the life that's really immersed in the world and actively engaged, and the world of those who withdraw into the depths of the existential encounter. And so, yeah, I'm not sure where else to go with that, except that I really resonated with that. I have a friend who's doing his PhD, or he was, really looking at how the private lives and the public lives of scholars, that's a really rich territory to mine into, that seam, that line between the private and the public lives of a lot of scholars, because they're really, because of the demands of academia and other kinds of things, sometimes there's a real disjunction between how the individual shows up in their written works and what they're wrestling with interiorly in terms of their living practice and their relationships. And yeah, what can we learn from sometimes those sharp contrasts?
It seems like you could end up with a richer position if you could bring all of that personal turmoil to bear within the thought. However, that is a much more difficult task. The degree of challenge is much higher, and the amount of time it would take to do that successfully, it's uncertain whether anyone has that time. So it's very practical to isolate part of yourself to be the wisdom conveyor and keep the rest for however it turns out for you.
Yeah, the
Also
dissident.
something
Oh,
that implicates Western history too. Like, not to say they didn't do this in the East, but it's, to me, characteristic of the West that there's been a struggle to make a place for the personal in the public space, right? That's kind of been the movement of the liberal forces in our culture over time, whereas the conservative backlash has always been to denounce something, but really to still allow it, but outside of the public space. And whether it's nudists or psychedelics or Christian confessionals or psychoanalytic confessionals or the whole range of the art of expressing your subjectivity, or people who want to go to 7-Eleven in their pajamas, there's a deep urge to place the private in public and demand that the public make itself safe and accommodating to the personal. And that's an interesting thing because it does seem to give us a different kind, maybe a richer culture in some ways, but it also takes you off the hook for that fundamental tension that you have to struggle through between the private and the public person.
It also gives us the people of Walmart.
Yeah, because the dissonance element that you both are talking about is really interesting. Because what do you do with that extra difference between you and Christ, or you and Socrates, or you? It's like, it's this. It's why they're such perennial figures, is because they evoke that so perfectly. They hold that tonos just beyond. Like if you're Brad Pitt's brother, you're like, I am so close to God and so far from God simultaneously. Just, it's the tonos those characters create. And yeah, we get to look in this kind of ultra individualistic kind of, the dissonance is everywhere, like vomits itself out from the unconscious into the public. And yet it also is a freedom that they didn't have in their time, that created a kind of, I would say, a kind of a mass neuroses of these kind of like somatic melancholy ailments that were just so internalizing these ridiculous idealizations of the transcendent and of cultural norms. And um, yeah, the dissonance aspect is really, because it can lead to humility, but it can also lead to anguish, right? Like existentially, um, that kind of distance can go like, oh, I'm so liberated, that I'm so lucky, or that I have something to aspire to, or that I'm so, like St. Augustine, right? He's like loathing in his like, what does John say at one time? Get over it, Kierkegaard, about this Regina woman. Just get over it, because I think there's some deep pragmatic truth in that like, the brooding at some point needs to resolve itself into something productive. And that's why I like when John talks about DC Schindler, and Schindler so well articulates the good as this like supra encounter that allows you to reframe everything because of its like sheer suchness or something like that. And it's um yeah, it's so interesting to see the dissonance and the identification with the good, or with these such profound figures. You two talked about the public private part. I mean, you both kind of do things in public consciously, um, with what, 1,000 podcast episodes. I know, Layman, you've had a Canadian radio station which you purposefully picked to both be interesting and to connect you to the public in a novel way. Um, did you resonate, like, on a more personal level, either of you, when he was talking about that, and how the uh, encounter with the public can be um, yeah, existentially meaningful?
In several ways. I think it is existentially meaningful and useful for people to struggle against the social order, right? It opens up the space for the individual to begin a journey. But then other flavors of that unfold. At least I'm describing my own journey. And the other flavors that unfold they include the basic holiness of being with people in civic spaces. And that's something I see in Kierkegaard and Socrates, that, Denmark and Athens, Christendom and Athens, let's say, there's a holiness to them. There's a holiness to the benign mutual recognition of the stranger, of the fellow citizen, right? And that's an element that is fundamental to your own growth and development and heart that you can only find in the encounter of the public space. And the struggle to be able to reach that mutual recognition when dealing with types of people who are unlike you. That presents a very interesting circumstance that I think can take you beyond what you can find merely in your own inward practice.
Yeah, Bruce, do you have any other thoughts on that as well? I know both of you are, I think, very conscious about being in public. And I loved your Earth Day presentation, by the way, Bruce. I meant to mention that last week. Like that's a choice, right? To put that out there. You could have shared that with 5 friends. You could have shared that with just yourself and gotten the joy or whatever you wanted to call it of that. But you chose to kind of share it publicly. And how is that meaningful for you? Or how does that, highlight some of the themes maybe John and Chris were alluding to? Or not, like totally, if this bores you. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, it's an interesting question for me, and I don't host as much. I think that's more of my character is I like smaller spaces than the big ones, and I also am not as fluent as Layman in talking to a camera. He does pretty well with that. But I think one of the things that I discovered that I think that they got into a little bit in their discussion was, yes, there's something really valuable about mulling through things, in retreat that you can arrive and distill insights, but that there's something in ourselves that we discover when we put ourselves into relationship with others. And so I often find in the smaller context, more than in podcasting or whatever, but in the classroom, that I say things and I know things that I don't know I could say, and I don't know that I knew, right? Or I don't know that I knew that in exactly that way until I'm in that situation with that field of difference and I'm navigating that space. And so I really appreciate the public for its ability to, you could say, transjectively enact dimensions of yourself that you don't have access to in your solitude. And speaking on I don't know if this is even relevant enough or appropriate, but it just was something that I really have felt. Here we are meeting by Zoom, and it's wonderful. And I think there's so much beautiful stuff that has been happening through radio and and TV and what we're doing on YouTube and other spaces. But I was in a coaching session, with the Aletheia. I've been talking about Aletheia sometimes, and one of the things that really came up for me when we were working through feeling kind of different embodied states and was tensions I'm holding in a way that I could relate to feelings of being suspended alone in the sky, which for me is like suspended alone in a virtual space. And kind of holding certain things together in that. What came through for me, I'm not sure how to put it. The word that came through for me was intercorporeal solidarity, and there was a real felt embodied desire for human communal interaction and support that is not being afforded by this medium. I love this, and I love what it affords. And there is something beautiful about being able to cast out a voice into as big a sphere as we're able to do right now. But I'm feeling something lost in terms of participating in an embodied way on a local level with groups of people that for me, I'm discovering there's a kind of a deep somatic hunger for the kind of solidarity that can be discovered in those contexts.
Part of me thinks of it as just the number of different communicating variables that are available. So that Zoom can do something fascinating that a phone call can't do. It can add in some extra sensory things, but there's still several important ones that are being left out. On the other hand, you might get the same problem if a person was blind or deaf or lacked a sense of smell in a personal space, that it is hunger to extend the number of communicating variables that are involved so their coordination can make it more real. So for me, I'm not sure, where my hunger is for embodiment or where my hunger is simply for an increase of the number of corresponding variables.
I think
I
very
want to add
soon
one more
Japan
thing
is
about
going to be making technology where we can smell each other while we're having.
That's why I went to Thunder Bay in September, was to gather real smells from Layman, and I have a little pile over in the corner that I just kind of wafted up to kind of keep the simulacrum
This
from
is
being
much
too
more
fake.
intercorporeal for Robert right now.
Yeah,
It's hard to say what's public. Like you can point to a podcast and go, yeah, that's public, but really I'm talking to one person. And then I don't have to even look at how people responded to that necessarily. Or, are we in public right now with each other? Are we in public with people who might watch this? Or are we in public with our idea of the people who might watch this? So it's uncertain. There's a kind of ambiguity and a kind of spectrum involved in that. And it depends a lot on where your focus goes in those moments.
yeah, the way we connect is so like our participation with each other socially creates like symbolon. It creates like psychic echoes in us, and that participation mediated by different technology definitely kind of changes the feel of the echoes and the topography. Zach Stein writes really eloquently on how the medium affects the message in education, and the scariness of having a generation raised on iPads and TikTok, not for the shocking content of TikTok, but for the disembodied experience of humanity that's unconsciously being integrated while all of the memes and little micro interactions happen, and at the same time, right, it expands the potential as far as like intellectually. If you think like the soul and the intellect are kind of different, intellectually you can get so much out of this medium, but soulfully the capacity to go, oh, I'm having a wedding, and going like, oh, I can't really come to that. You're like one of my disembodied friends. I don't really actually participate in you the way I would have 80 years ago, where it would have been clear that if I was invited, it's because I liked you and you liked me, or the whole renavigation of what it means to be social in this, especially COVID. COVID made it like normalized digital relationships as being kind of a possibility of a bedrock, the way it really wasn't before all the Zoom literacy happened. And yeah, even that you can kind of communicate about, like you can have a Bible study group that prays together. Like it really works the whole um, landscape. And if we are these dialectical, participating, embodied creatures, yeah, the medium, whether, I mean, even the novel, right? The Kierkegaard is also on the cusp of the shift to realism in novels. It's like what that wasn't even a thing much before his time, and now it's like you have to have the narrator and the drama and all. It's so different than say Oedipus, which is like this collective unconscious sacrifice to literature almost. So it's cool how even we're bringing up the medium of our existential inquiry and our situated thrownness in time and space.
I think the digital mediums create an expectation that we should deal primarily with people we like and get along with. Whereas, for Kierkegaard and especially for Socrates, the social communication was just whoever happened to live in your town, right? There's a good chance you don't like most of those people. There's going to be a lot of friction. There's going to be a lot of disagreement in this beautiful place. Like we can say that I'm in public because I'm podcasting, but really I'm dealing with a very narrow band of people compared to the general population, people I can get along with fairly well. I push the boundaries of that, but not the way I push the boundaries if I go down to the DMV or something. So I think I wonder about whole generations being attuned to this feeling that they should have a certain quality of interaction and shouldn't have to deal with people of very disreputable types who they instinctively don't get along with, which used to be the general definition of the public.
That's why we have Salon of the Band.
What is that? I missed that reference.
We do have a one series on our channel called Salon of the Band. It was Layman's idea. What was it? The Salon de Refus or something like that. I can't remember what that was, but a French inspiration for it. But basically, it's a series of dialogues with people who have proven to be difficult enough that they get kicked out everywhere. And so it's a series of dialogues about what those dynamics are for those people.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, the self-selection, the self-isolation, self-selection is so unhealthy for egoic development. The ego wants nothing more than to stay in the safest fantasy possible, and we've created these devices that are like, oh, virtual reality for $20 a month. You can basically just bombard your intellectual perception with itself or with things that just feel good. Yeah, and again, like that, even COVID failed to be as existentially fruitful as it probably could have been, because we were so comfortable by like Amazon and YouTube and all of these things to go, oh, it's not bad. There's not a spiraling out of control death rate that's costing economic catastrophe. And I'm still watching the newest Shark Tank or whatever I'm isolating with, going, oh, this new gadget is so cool. Yeah, it's not comfortable.
There's a sweet spot in there that we're looking for, right? Because there is a risk in being over adapted to a particular self-enclosed, self-feedback channel. At the same time, it's not necessarily great and developmental to constantly be exposed to the harassment and dullness of dealing with all kinds of people who you can't do any sense making with at all, because it's just constant hassle and friction. So there's some sweet spot between those two. Just like there's some sweet spot when we talk about the gadfly in philosophy Christ and Kierkegaard and Socrates, there's that gadfly has to be a very balanced or nuanced position, some kind of sweet spot, because it can't just be somebody who, and we run into this problem with Salon of the Band, is making this decision about, is this just somebody who's so unpalatable that they should be rejected from every space? Or do they actually have something to say? Where are they on that spectrum? There are people who are extraordinarily palatable in almost every space, and maybe they don't have anything to say at all. So you're looking for someone to be that gadfly who can hold their position, but not be merely stubborn and contrarian. So that's the philosophical sweet spot that we need to be aiming at.
One thing I was picking up from that I wanted to bring up here from their talk was about Chris worrying that maybe he gets Kierkegaard all the way wrong. And then John saying, well, maybe you get him usefully wrong, right? Or you do get him usefully wrong. And what's involved in those dynamics of usefully wrong? Sometimes I tease Layman that the Nietzsche he presents is the Nietzsche that no one has ever seen until he's passed through the lens of the layman, right? But it might be a very useful Nietzsche to be out there. But I also feel that I've been feeling that recently in terms of I've been in some online debates with some meta-modernists who like to trash on Integral a lot. And
Are
I
they
know
puppets?
what's that?
Nothing. I said,
Okay.
are they puppets?
Oh yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And I sometimes think possibly the Wilbur or the Integral I'm presenting is not one that's ever manifested before, but how useful is it for it to manifest this way in my, so yeah, what do you think about those dynamics there?
I think there's a tremendous honesty in recognizing them, because we don't know, right? I can't know what Nietzsche was working on. Just like I just did this talk on Hegel last week, and nobody really understands Hegel, and all of the Hegelians think that everyone else has bought into some weird conformist false notion of what Hegel was saying, right? And so you have to be, I think, to move the conversation forward up front about the fact that it is potentially your own skewing. But speaking of Hegel, I think that affords us an additional possibility, which is to see what kind of reconciliation we can create by virtue of those things. I run into this problem with Integral myself, which is people like hold it up and then they hold up a critique. Well, these are the things it's left out or got wrong. And in my mind, I always go, no, the thing you're describing is what I mean by integral. Like that's all the stuff you're affirming. That's what I'm talking about. But what I'm doing in that move is sort of trying to fold them back into the same thing together. And I think that affords me an interesting move in my own psyche, is to constantly be like tearing apart my definitions and folding them back in, which I couldn't do unless I could see some potential parallax between what I think might be being talked about and what I think I might be talking about.
Hmm. I'm out of my element to say this maybe, but because I don't know that much in terms of Torah scholarship and all that, but with the midrash and all that. But I think the whole Torah structure in a way speaks to that kind of dynamic, that there's the story and then there's the interpretation of the story, that there's the interpretation, and basically it's revealing that we're always in this dialogical mode with the streams of our history.
You guys know Michael Levin at all, the biologist?
Mm-hmm.
He talks about in these weird ways how you like the beings just have to be dialectic and dialogical, and if we're trying to extend our horizons in time and space away from like death entropy and towards an unknown possibility, then a lot of these wrestlings make a lot more sense, and a lot of like the need for ambiguity. And John talks about this orientation book, which I don't find to be the most fun read. It's like if you found the nerdiest, driest Heideggerian and he wrote a really good book, this might be what it would feel like. So it's really interesting, but it's also like not fun to read, just for the like as a reader. But it's the tension between the need to have a perspective and the need to listen to other perspectives. It's always there. It's such a right now we're extending our wills through each other to do this. We're not just selfishly what did John call the Leibnizian monad, right? We don't organize and orient and enact in the world in a monistic way. We're always planning socially and with our idea of our future self and our past self, and it's such a complex web that yeah, if you don't appreciate all of that intersubjectivity and intrasubjectivity, then a lot of what these striking figures are doing isn't quite as interesting either. But if we are these dialogical, self-extending, self-transforming metabolic systems that can't algorithmically master life, then we're forced into the messy dialogical processes. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
One of the things I thought to bring up when I listened to this episode was around confession. I think there's a really rich vein there. And in my mind, I stratify it into three types. Like, what does confession do to us? Right? Bruce was talking about things you might only discover that you have the ability to say by saying to some other people. And there's a lot of self-knowledge that's only available when mediated through your exchanges with another. And that's one of the things that makes psychotherapy potentially very useful to people. You can say something and discover something about yourself that you wouldn't have found unless you said it. And then there's the possibility of narcissism, which is that there's a lot of confession that goes nowhere, which only confirms us in this mode of constantly articulating what's going on for ourselves in a way where we learn nothing and also don't communicate in relationship with anyone else. And so a society that's confessional can become a society of sort of flat, empty, exhibitionistic presentation of what appears to be the personal, but really goes nowhere. Or it can be a method of discovering the personal by making it interpersonal. But also there's this element of the confession which takes us into remorse and repentance, right? That the confession is a way of getting in touch with places in yourself where your values are pulling on each other or in collision that you might normally ignore because you don't want to undergo that tension between what you think is important and how you've been behaving is sort of the classic tension in remorse. But yeah, those are my initial three categories of confession. But I wonder how you guys feel about what it is that confession does for us or to us.
One thing that I thought about with confession, and there are different ways to go about it, but the contrast between Buddhist and Christian traditions around it is interesting. In Buddhism, especially early Buddhism, there was an orthopraxy, but not an orthodoxy, not so much. And similarly, there was confession, but it was always communal, not private with an individual. And so the West is exactly the mirror of that, with the orthodoxy and with private confession. And so it's interesting to look at what different kind of social, cultural, psychological dynamics are at play in those different kinds of contexts. I can see benefits, obviously, for both. There could be, that the whole narcissistic or surface cultural virtue signaling dynamic at play in public confession, right? But at the same time, I think for a Westerner, it could be very interesting to engage, at least initially, in an experiment in a public confessional space. I think there are different psycho technologies that involve some of those kinds of practices, but one of my questions is, what are the expectations or protocols that you could set up around such a practice to help mitigate tendencies to use it for simple virtue signaling or social conformity or those kinds of dynamics? What would need to be built into the process that could actually allow, in a public way, confession to be as authentic as we would want, that we hope that the private confession allows one to be. So I think there could be really powerful communal benefits for public active confession.
Yeah, I see dangers in both, right? It seems like the danger of the private confession is that the other person or the institution gains privileged access to your personal contents.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of talk about how Scientology might do that with data elicited in their sessions. The danger in the public confession is that there might be really sensitive psychodynamic regions of ourselves that we simply would not speak to in public because we don't know how to. And so those public confession zones could be very therapeutic, but there might be all kinds of perverse elements of the subconscious and the private that we just never would bring forward, and so never get inspected or healed.
Mm-hmm.
In private, we've got things like therapeutic codes of conduct to try to mitigate that. What would we have in public spaces? Certain ritual routines, but one of the things that leapt out at me is how do you create an incentive structure for that? Right? We see all the time in the American corporate life, they paid a fine and no one admitted any wrongdoing, right? We have a legal system that's set up to be more punitive to you if you agree to have confessed about what went on with your company, especially if it created harm. How could you set up a system where it would be incentivized to want to confess and therefore go through the healing and transformation that confession and remorse would allow? So I mean, that's true as like a general feature of public confessions is how do you incentivize it? How does the individual feel like they're going to get something rather than be at risk in making that gesture?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because you're asking people to encounter their shadow essentially, and you're asking them to do it in a way that'll be generative of either positivity for them or the community or both. Like, because when there's a shared confession, that allows for shared consciousness to emerge as well, right? Like there's a transjectivity that can't take place normally inwardly. I mean, that's a power of the New Testament, right? Is God, and in Plato too, like it's there. But the idea that like I don't have to actually be accountable to society because I'm accountable to the divine. I have a transcendent relationship, and Christ is saying that all the time. He says, "Don't worry about being judged. You want to be judged by these fools or by God? Like it's an easy decision." So he's giving you the psychic flexibility to not be shamed in public, to not be exposed, but also it's losing that interconnectivity to society too if you don't do it correctly. So yeah, and the encounter with the other, because you have to pull not only yourself to the encounter, but an image of the other to encounter the other. So there's this whole dynamic. So it's like a lot more happening than just like a dyadic thing. There's all sorts of, I would say, kind of alchemical elements happening in the power. Because even to a stranger, right? Have you ever, either as a person or just seen someone just break down crying in public because they lost their family member or they just got divorced? And you're like, I'm on the bus. I'm trying to go to Walmart and you're like bearing your soul. But it's so human to just listen. We just naturally sympathize and let the bearing kind of happen because on some level we realize like that's all the person, like they need to birth it publicly and just where they are rather than contain it. And it's great if you had like a Judaic tradition to deal with mourning or to deal with these things, but just having a public expression is so profound when you're bearing the weight of some of any, even a joy. Even you want to tell a stranger like, I'm so happy I just got engaged or whatever it is. People do the joyous confessions as well, and there's something very real. Even I don't know. I love like laughter in movie theaters. I think we talked about this before, but the shared public being of our being really is essential to our nature in some ways that are hard to, like from a Cartesian point of view, see necessarily.
The invocation of the physiological demonstration of almost inarticulate emotion that's present in some of those examples makes me think about how narrow or wide we consider confession to be. And what popped into my head was a time my dad worked on a fish boat on Alert Bay, which is a sort of quaquetal settlement. So I would go over there when I was a kid, and they had a cultural hall full of old quaquetal masks in various, grimaces and crazy faces, bright colors. And I saw or imagined when I was a kid all of these tribes coming together for like a collective processing and decision making process. And that people, I imagine people getting up in front of each other and just doing a really intense physical demonstration where they made these faces, which only much later became stylized into masks. That originally it was you present yourself as an enraged otter or whatever it was, and that your confession wasn't a verbally mediated propositional confession of what you've done or what's going on and happening to you, but some multidimensional, highly affective, maybe largely unconscious presentation, that there's so many different aspects of our being that we could be confessing. And each of our setups for allowing confessional tends to privilege one slice of communication.
Yeah, because there's something powerful about expressing that kind of unconscious material that allows it to, again, it's like you're both seeing it yourself almost for the first time and together. I mean, the philosophical fellowship practice, I think, very much is trying to do this kind of group confession of some like unspoken truth that you've never encountered before. Um, and it can be highly symbolic and highly gestural and highly um, non-formulaic in that you're not trying to enact certain categories necessarily, but you're trying to almost like reveal the pre-categorical that you've been kind of like encountering in the last 7 days or 7 months or whatever the kind of periods are, and go, oh, I've been carrying around all this knowledge that spring is about to happen, and then we're sharing it publicly, and now it's kind of happening. Um, so yeah, the that'll be cool if they bring in all of John's interest in like ritual to this conversation on like these transcendent characters and this, because I think they what we're saying now is much more in that ritual side of things, the kind of types of confession and even like the tone of the confessor, right? I don't know. I'm much certain times in my life I want like a really dour, serious confession. Sometimes I want a lighthearted, almost like brotherly kind of confession. And there's different, like again, we talked about this earlier, the self-selection and the idiosyncratic. It's not excessive. I think in our very like efficiency-oriented culture, the aesthetic feels excessive, but it's so vital sometimes to facilitating the actual like ritual of confession and the catharsis and transformation of um, those things. You think, Layman, all confession has a revelatory element to it for the participants?
Well, if I go back to what I initially said about three types of confession, then at least one of them doesn't, right? There's a sort of a wearying, non-revelatory character to many people's public confessions. And even in our private lives, we probably all, know people we care about who speak at great length about something they've clearly told you 1,000 times, and there's no new insight in this repetition of it either.
Oh, that's the
So
repetition
that's
of
there,
Kierkegaard,
there,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
that's that gross
yeah.
repetition.
There's a type of confessional trap where it becomes
Mm.
something like narcissism. And I think too many people fall into that, and it's exacerbated by confessional tools such as digital media.
Yeah, the orthodoxy orientation as a um, unquestionable act of like self-expression and self-liberation or something, when it's a caricature of that, or unconscious of that. And it really has to be conscious. If you approach these kind of patterns very unconsciously, then they become like self-revealing hypocrisies almost. I think that's why Christ is able to be so effective, because he's able to like go into the hypocrisy and reveal it in ways that it was not supposed to be, come the repetition that Kierkegaard is naming. I think that's fair.
I think it's inherently revelatory where there's a flourishing affective range being brought forward, whether it's ecstasy or pathos or sorrow or surprise, or I think that, and maybe there's an organic signature or range to that. But where we see confession become narcissistic and sterile, I think we see a collapse or a foreclosure on the range of affects that are present in the confession. The person's giving it the same tone and analyzing it with the same emotional themes that they always use.
Yeah, I think there's some real truth to that pathos. Like if you have the pathos there, it's almost like um, effortlessly transformative, or at least effortlessly engaging, where like a liturgy that's just really alive with pathos, you go, oh wow, I participated in that and got something from it. But if there's like a pathos of bullshitting, or of a kind of wavelength that can't support the character of the people participating in it, um
There's a lot of questions we're going to have to face about high level simulations of pathos going
yeah.
forward. Like, if machines can do it, if machines can bullshit their way into a highly convincing pathos, what does that mean? One of the things that popped up for me a few minutes ago was this question that I've stood in front of before, stood before it before, which is how much emotional intelligence is represented for me by someone who's a really emotionally evocative singer. Because my immediate sense is that they have tremendous access to this emotional richness. But then I sit back and I think, well, actually, she's singing a song that somebody else wrote professionally about experiences that someone else had. And she's singing it every night for years. Doesn't that suggest a tremendous distance from the emotion that's being presented? Maybe emotion is only being simulated here, and that's what I'm responding to. And I don't know which one it is. There's an ambiguity about the validity of the confession that's involved. And we're all going to have to face that more and more as our access to reality through digital tools allows them to present highly convincing simulations of confession.
Yeah, the some of the Kyoto School writers talk about how the first time, and it's like a very Zen flavor, right? There's a spontaneity that the first time to any expression happens in a person, it's kind of felt and it's experienced because the novelty of it all happens. But then because we're intelligent beings, we store that information as memory and behavior, and we can recall it and apply it without feeling, and we can get into these like unfeeling loops where we're applying insightfulness but in such a detached way that the pathos of it isn't really generated. And then we're so like erudite in our self power that we may not even realize that. And then we become detached from our kind of existential, like the moment in our capacity to apply ideas and concepts that really aren't felt, even though they had to have been. Like the moment you discover fire or the moment you discover whatever technology the first time, it's probably really exciting. So yeah, keeping the pathos, and the pathos is such a double-edged sword too, because it can feed that narcissism and just all the feelings. Oh, I felt so good during that encounter with the numinous, and so therefore, and then you just like that's what like you spin out into all of this meaning making that is actually maybe bullshit. Um, yeah. Are there good pathos cultures? I just feel like our culture is so like we've almost inherited a legacy that's poor at pathos at this point.
One thing I've been sitting here thinking about is a Ladakhi funeral I saw. And, it goes on for days. And there's all these different kinds of ritualized elements. And there's all kinds of people gathered in a room doing different tasks to support the mourner. And the mourner is apparently, I can't understand Ladakhi, but apparently reciting something, but reciting it with such pathos and such feeling that it was a really, for me, very interesting to watch, as obviously this is ritual, and yet it feels so deeply personal for that person. There's the whole group that they're not there crying and they're not there comforting, but they're there comforting by their presence and by their ritual activity in all kinds of other domains that are supporting the expression, while the person goes through the recitation of some lines in what sounds like a very deep, authentic wailing and keening. To me, that felt, I mean, who knows, if I understood the language and I knew the culture better, maybe it's not healthy, but to me, that felt like such a profoundly communally supported, ritually held container for the expression of feeling in a very safe environment, that I haven't encountered very much in Western contexts. And the other day I heard Howard Bloom talking. He was talking with Greg Henriquez, and he told this story about how you can stand before a crowd and be energized and actually take in the energy of all those people and have ecstatic moments, but other times it can be profoundly draining. And he was talking about John Mellencamp after giving a dynamic performance, but as soon as he walks behind the stage, he looks like a dead man. He's been utterly drained. And I'm thinking, what's going on, in that kind of context where is that maybe what Layman is talking about in terms of it's the sheer display, but it's not rooted in a way that actually is nourishing. So it ends up being, almost like you're sacrificing your energy to a public dynamic in a way that doesn't return back to you. Yeah.
Singing in particular, because you have to. I've learned a little bit from singing coaches because I like chanting. So every once in a while, I'll dip into like the world of singing knowledge to anyways. But like it's actually a hard skill. Poetry too. Normally, if you want to present like a really powerful like Slipknot death metal performance, you like psych yourself up and then you give all this emotion, and it's a really it can burn out your throat and burn out all these things. So you have to learn to be able to like produce the outcome without needing to generate the affect that kind of like through a flow state almost generates the outcome that you want. And I've seen really good poets, because a lot of people say like, there's at least Platonists say like poetry is unconscious, and it's like it's all this nonsense that's very powerful but also very unconscious. And there are, I think, definitely poets that are alive that you can like learn about their history, that they very much are much more conscious about how they use poetry. It's not just this flowery, impulsive, unconscious thing, but it's like, how do I take the capacity for poetry and apply it to somewhere I want to, rather than it just kind of pouring forth. So yeah, there's a really, what you're saying, Bruce, is there's a huge tension between like completely missing, completely way off, and then unconscious and conscious expressions of pathos, which are so healthy, right? Like Aristotle talks so much about catharsis, and the Greeks got this, and they had these amphitheaters and did these tragedies, and the 3-day, Ring of the Nibelung must have been just amazing the first time they started doing that. And you go, wow, I was transformed. And then I went home, and the opportunities for that are not as apparent in our culture as maybe they are in other cultures.
It's a tricky thing with pathos processing. It does seem like there are other and ancient cultures that had enough time to develop public ways of supporting that experience. And yet you mentioned the ring cycle there, and I thought of, Nietzsche's description of finally going to see Wagner performed at Bayreuth, where the king had given like a town to just be Wagner performing, right? And he was expecting this really rich experience that he'd gone through himself with the music, and he walked away going, this is really bad. There's not only nothing here, but the kind of pathos that's being presented is going to be bad for young Germans. It's going to give them that thing that we would later associate with the Nazis. He was describing it and really worried about their inability to do anything with the pathos that was being publicly expressed in that fashion. But the other thing that popped up for me in terms of this idea that our culture is not very good in this regard. There's a lot of truth to that, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. Like Foucault famously in his last book said, we really shouldn't think of the Victorians as having suppressed sexuality. Their limitations on what you could say immediately produced the greatest explosion of sexual communication in recorded history. It's better to think of that as a device that forced forward certain kinds of production. Likewise, we're in a culture where people have been trying to find the pathos that are artists and humorists and playwrights and the production of the field of psychotherapy and all of these areas where the so-called West has been an engine to generate people who were moved to try to find and valorize and explore pathos. I think that's a really strong current, and we might, historically speaking, be in a very privileged position to know about pathos because of the way our culture is set up.
Yeah, the human spirit of the American human spirit was like amazing. The Wright brothers and jazz music and the 60s, all these different things. Incredible vision, which takes pathos and motivation. And yeah, so it is weird that you're right. We probably came from one of the highest points of pathos to where we are right now. Yeah.
About finding ways to express pathos. So that was part of our early conversations with John in the Rethinking Religion series. We really looked a lot at grief and processing the affects of individuals who are in a time between worlds, in the meaning crisis, in the polycrisis, and that there's not very good systems for bringing up those feelings and generatively exploring, processing those things. And so what kind of rituals, like Joanna Macy's grief process or work that reconnects, and we talked about a number of different things, but yeah, I think it remains a really important question. And I think it's a good point that certain limitations have afforded maybe new possibilities for new forms of expression, but I think it's on us now to find those.
Coming back to Kierkegaard and decision, the thing that strikes me about pathos is its double nature, right? That there is a tension, a pulling, a friction there. Like grief, mourning the death of God, like we talked to John about several times. There's something in it which isn't merely having an emotion. Some people describe just the enactment of emotion as being essentially a pathic quality. But it seems to me you have to have something in you that disagrees, right? Not only am I mourning the death of God, I also feel like that shouldn't be the case. I'm torn. I not only lost a loved one, I'm in rebellion against the world in which that could occur. I'm having two different things that very strongly pull on each other. So for me, pathos is like an intense inter emotion. And in that way, it kind of structurally duplicates this Kierkegaardian sense that of the decision moment that's only truly transformative or self-deepening or aligning to value if there's something virtuous in both of the decisions you can make. If they really are pulling on each other, it puts you in that intensely personalized opportunity for self-transcendence.
Yeah, it just bums me out when people take a position of some extreme and don't kind of embrace the both, because it's so easy to argue pessimism or to argue optimism, or any ism really, and it's like the tension of it that's so interesting, because again, like we're always participating in this intersubjective field. So these isms matter not only to us, but like collectively, and that they are some of the space that we use to navigate culture and to navigate our identities as well. So it's if they don't matter, then it's like a farce, right? Like from comedy to tragedy to farce, in that kind of cycle, and the kind of detached. We've talked about this maybe to death, but the kind of detached modern cynicism is not at all provocative the way Diogenes would be. Or I've slowly been reading Sloterdijk, and it's like he's got such a cool modern voice, like Gabriel Marcel or some of these other more well-known existentialists. I'm like, oh, this is so cool to have the kind of reverence, the reverent irreverence that the cynics had, and also the modern consciousness that I have, that I'm embodied with. And it's so great because when you have the best art critics don't love complaining, they love the art that they're complaining about, and they're it's aspirational complaint. But when the aspiration is gone, then it's like those two Muppet old guys that are like, this is a stupid, and it's so close. The irony, if you just tip it too far in one direction or the other, you end up missing the profundity of it all.
Statler and Waldorf.
Very nice. I knew that any Muppet references would be from your part of the Zoom landscape.
I'd loop back to Hakuin on that tension point as well, because
Mhm.
some of his writings are very explicit in his condemnation of other Zen lineages, which he calls do-nothing Zenists,
Mhm.
right? People who sort of sit there and try to be empty and go with the flow, and for them the point of the koan is that your thinking can't solve the problem, so just let go of your thinking. Whereas what he's saying is there's an actual transformation that's possible, but something has to be at stake. You have to actually care, right? You have to let the different components of the koan that are paradoxical really fight each other. And you have to really try to solve this thing that can't be solved. And unless you encounter the pathos of that, then it doesn't have any, biophysiological, biopsychological, bioemotional transformative capacity.
Yeah, the passion part is what is great about Hakuin, right? Because it's easy to go, oh, wu wei, detach, go with the flow, become an observant to nature in this way, and then all of a sudden you're in Maya, according to Hakuin. You've actually become so deluded that you're like the best at deluding yourself, and he's mocking your skillful delusion because you're not sweeping the floor. You're not actually engaging in that spontaneous immediacy that Zen is trying to point to with its like no propositional pointing to direct mind. And you're like, oh, I propositionally got it. You're like gloating to yourself about how detached you can be. Um, and yeah, that's why he's so great. His vulgarity is this exact kind of sarcasm that Plato doesn't really express in Socrates, but that is meant by the Socratic irony. Is the sharpness. Yes, Hakuin's the best at that because it's easy to have a couple peak experiences or a couple great concepts or whatever and think you figured it out, and then you're almost missing the Kierkegaardian subjectivity that John is like and Christopher are going to such lengths to kind of point out to us as an audience. Um, yeah, that's a great point, Layman.
Touches on the discussion of comedy as well, because the comedian presents the liberating power of humor by taking a negative position, and not a sort of philosophically apophatic position where the divine is present as emptiness or something like that, but where the good thing is being presented fundamentally as a bad thing, right? So Hakuin will talk about wisdom as poison. Right? He'll give you a strong negative affect, and then you're forced to encounter it in the mode of this kind of tension between opposites that we're talking about in Kierkegaard. You have no choice. If the thing you want the most is being conveyed to you by a person who has it, who's phrasing it as the thing you want the least, then you've got to struggle with it.
Yeah, that's why I like Zen's version of humility, where like the leader of the group also has to like clean the toilet, or where there's like honor in cooking the vegetables, not just being in certain positions. It's really the paradoxicality. Like the New Testament does it in its implied meaning in the story. So the structures are always ironic. The king of the Jews is the slave and the guy that dies, and all the irony is dramatic irony in the literary sense. But the Zen irony is so capable of non-symbolically showing you what it's trying to do. It's like almost you're like looking for the symbol, but it's just not there, and it's not there-ness you notice the ordinary, which has to be infused with the one as well. Um, yeah, I would love to see John rant more in the Zen form of irony rather than the. I mean, I love what he's doing. I'm not saying like, oh, he shouldn't do that and should do this instead. But in addition to that, the kind of Eastern irony, I think, gets at a lot of the Socratic irony really well. Like I love your stories, Bruce, when you share because culturally, you come from such a different perspective than I do, and it's such a lived perspective. So you're not quoting books you've read, but you're quoting things you've been passionate about. It's like, oh, that jars me in a way that a fact just couldn't. Um,
I appreciate your saying that. And I have a meeting in 15 minutes.
Okay. We're not going to go on for 4 more hours. You don't want to go till 6 or 7 tonight Eastern.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I appreciate. I was just thinking earlier today how wonderful it is to go through these episodes a second time with other people, because they're so rich. You have all these little, like, at least I go, oh wow, this is great. I love this perspective that they're articulating, and then getting to kind of be surprised by the what you had noticed and re-encounter it. Yeah, I just appreciate that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.